Good afternoon and namaste. Welcome to very special session of NIICE on relevance of Panchsheel in a fractious world order. The Panchsheel, or five principles of peaceful coexistence, emerged as a cornerstone of foreign policy in many countries such as Nepal, India, China, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Tanzania, Egypt, Ghana, the United Nations Charter, Non-Aligned Movement, and many others. The Panchsheel, or five principles of peaceful coexistence, consist of non-interference, peaceful coexistence, equality and mutual benefit, respect for territorial integrity, and non-aggression. It has huge relevance in the modern foreign policy making as it strengthens bilateral relations, promotes global peace, economic cooperation, conflict resolution, and sovereignty and independence. The Panchsheel principle draws inspirations from the rich philosophical and ethical traditions of Buddhism. Since Nepal is the land of Buddha, we thought Nepal should play an important role in promoting Panchsheel, as one of Nepal's foreign policy objectives is also to promote global peace. In fact, yesterday, the newly appointed Foreign Minister of Nepal, Dr. Arju Rana Deva, affirmed Nepal's conviction for non-aligned movement and principle of Panchsheel. It is in this context we have organized this special session on relevance of Panchsheel in a fractious world order, and we have very distinguished speaker, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat is a former Indian diplomat who served in numerous Indian missions around the globe, including Cote d'Ivoire, Bangladesh, Mongolia, the US, Russia, Sweden, Nigeria, Liberia, and Jordan. Within the Ministry of External Affairs, he has contributed significantly to the economic, West Asia and North Africa, and Consular Division. Notably, he held the position of Director General, Joint Secretary for the Gulf and Haj Division in New Delhi. He also served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in the rank of Ambassador at the Embassy of India in Moscow. Prior to his retirement in May 2016, he served as India's Ambassador to Jordan and Libya and the High Commissioner to Malta, and it was from June 2012 to May 2016. During his term in Nigeria and Libya, he played a crucial role in conflict management and provided a vital assistance to strengthen India during challenging times. He is actively involved in various professional and academic organizations. He is a member of All India Management Association, Delhi Management Association, the Oxford and Cambridge Society of India, and the Association of Indian Diplomats, which is an association of former diplomats. He is also an honorary member of Indian Trade Council, Brussels, and served on the governing or advisory council of India-Italy Chamber of Commerce and Industry, CII-Confederation of Indian Industries, Asia-Africa Chamber, and BRICS Chamber of Commerce. Ambassador Trigunayat holds several prestigious positions, including being on the board of Raisina Dialogue, USANAS Foundation, and India-Japan Foundation. He is a secretary of the Association of Indian Diplomats, which is former Ambassadors Association, and chairman of the Confederation of Educational Excellence and Peaceful Mind Foundation. Additionally, he served as non-executive chairman of the Atmanirbhar Global Chamber of Commerce and Industry and president of the Millennial India International Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Agriculture, New Delhi. He is also a distinguished fellow and head of the West Asia Expert Group at Vivekananda International Foundation. Further showcasing his global engagement, Ambassador Trigunayat is also visiting fellow at Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, NIICE, and advisor to National Cooperative Development Cooperation. Ambassador Trigunayat, once again, welcome to today's session. We'd like to request you to make your remarks in around 20 to 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. We'd also like to request all our participants to drop their question in Zoom chat, Facebook Live, Twitter, or on WhatsApp. We'd also like to request you to follow us on our Facebook, Twitter, and subscribe Nepal NIICE Nepal's YouTube channel. And we'd also like to request all our participants to refrain from sharing inappropriate images, videos, or links, else you'll be immediately blocked. Now I'd like to hand over the floor to Ambassador Anil Trigunayat. Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, for your very kind invitation for me to share my thoughts on this very important topic. And I hope that this will be very useful, especially as the title suggests, that we are living through a fractious world order. I'm also grateful to all the audience which have joined us today and the good work, I must compliment you, that the NIICE is doing. We are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the principles of Panchsheel, or the peaceful coexistence. And that is something that we all know is the most desirable quest of the world community. But then we live in a real world. Then the real world is today going through a terrible global governance crisis. We are seeing the geopolitical contestation, the geoeconomic contestation, geo-religious contestation, and the geotechnological contestation among nations. The conflicts in Russia, Ukraine, the conflicts in Israel and Hamas war, the conflicts in various other hotspots, whether it is in Africa or in Middle East or elsewhere. These are increasingly becoming more and more difficult to handle. Why I said the global governance is in crisis is that the major multilateral institutions like the United Nations, WTO, and others have lost really their functional relevance. They are unable to perform to the expectations of a very large number of countries, especially when we see that any of the permanent 5 countries, which includes United States, UK and France on the one side, that is called G3, and then Russia and China on the other, which is called G2. So within the council also, you are looking at G3 versus G2 contestation. That is something that is very difficult because each one of them have not only in some wars, they are themselves involved, but then we are seeing that unilateralism is taking precedence over multilateralism. The principles of Panchsheel essentially focus on 2 things. As Dr. Jaiswal mentioned, that one is the respect for the other country, its territorial integrity, and you should not invade another country. You should respect the sovereignty of the country. We should not interfere in other countries' internal affairs. We should work for the mutual benefit on equal terms. And there should be, then only it was expected that there will be a peaceful coexistence. Now, all of you know that it was in 1954 that the first time after the India-Tibetan Accord through Chinese was discussed, the agreement was signed, that these principles which have existed, and as was mentioned in the Buddhism lore and these other ancient civilizations, it is pretty common to have those. They were framed in a way which provided some kind of a new, I would say, hope for the world, which was at that time also quite fractious and became more fractious with the Cold War 2.0 kind of Cold War scenario, in which majority of the countries afterwards took towards the non-aligned movement, which came into being from 55 onwards after the Bandung Conference. So these 5 principles of coexistence, which we call as Panchsheel, were also incorporated in the charter by the Bandung Conference. In the 10 principles, these 5 were incorporated. And then subsequently, 57, in the United Nations also, these were incorporated. So there is no doubt that these principles are absolutely essential and are also a common sense. But then it was the India and China, the 2 major countries, which had started in Asia. At that time, as you know, that China had become a communist country, and Zhou Enlai, he was the prime minister, who's the one who actually spoke about these in the first place. And then in India, we used to have Prime Minister Nehru. But then in China, the Secretary General or the leader was Mao Zedong. And he thought rather differently compared to his Prime Minister. So therefore, there is a very interesting story that goes, and that has been written in 2004, when we had the 50th anniversary of these. And so the only person who was surviving at that time, he said he was the only person from the delegation who survived. His name was Mr. V.V. Paranjpe from the Indian side. And Mr. V.V. Paranjpe wrote in Hindustan Times in 2004, and he mentioned that the Indian delegation was nominally led by Mr. Raghavan, who was our ambassador at the time, and Mr. T.N. Kaul, very famous person, again, ambassador, who was at that time heading the China division in the Ministry of External Affairs. And he had understood about these principles. He spoke to Prime Minister Nehru, and I'm talking this in January 1954, when they went to discuss about this agreement, which was signed in April. And at that time, he persuaded Nehru that these are very good principles and we should discuss. Now, when the Indian delegation arrived and proposed it in the first, this was a part of his speech, that these should be incorporated. And surprisingly, the response from the Chinese Foreign Office was, number one, delayed. And when it came finally, it was negative. They did not want to include these principles of coexistence, which were promoted and promulgated by their own foreign and prime minister. That is Zhou Enlai. So these were not there. Finally, then when Zhou Enlai, who was away in Geneva, when he returned, at that time, a via media was found out. And you can imagine the delegation which is negotiating from the Chinese side could not have done it on its own, this thing. So he was perhaps the foreign minister or the prime minister at the time. Zhou Enlai was superseded by Mao Zedong, and this was not agreed. Then the minister came. When he came back, he saw it, he understood it, and he said, okay, we can find a via media, we will put it into the preamble of the agreement. So then these 5 principles were incorporated in the preamble of the agreement. Now, there is no doubt that they are timeless. Their relevance is absolutely not in doubt. But for that, what is most important is that the countries which are signing these agreements must be honest to themselves. And what we have seen is between India and China, for that matter, within 8 years, we had a war. That was in 1962. And since then, until 1988, we really had no diplomatic relations, or at a very low level. And then finally, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited Beijing, and there he again reiterated the importance of these 5 principles. Every time we have seen that we have gone ahead and talked, these were reiterated as if they were the constant. So these are fine as an example, but then we don't see them being practiced. Several agreements, several bilateral agreements were signed. Several confidence-building measures and institutional mechanisms were created between India and China to keep the border away from skirmishes, away from confrontation, away from conflicts. But we have seen what happened in 2017 in Doklam. Then we saw what happened in 2020 in Galwan, when soldiers lost their lives, 21 soldiers from Indian side. So I think that this is something that has created a tremendous mistrust between the 2 countries. And then we are seeing that although we have institutional mechanisms, India wants to follow dialogue, diplomacy, and peace with all its neighbors, including with China. And therefore, we have seen the 21 meetings of the border Corps commanders meeting and 15 of the WMCC mechanism between them. That's only very recently at the Kazakh in Astana summit of SCO, Foreign Minister Jaishankar and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met and they discussed. Then we have seen that on 10th of July, Mr. Wang Yi wrote to Indian National Security Advisor that congratulating him for resuming his post and saying that we should try to work on this border issue. Now, border issue, I am telling you, is so important with any country, between any countries, because it is not only a sovereignty issue, it is also a very emotive issue between the people. It also shows the intent, and it should be discussed bilaterally. It should be discussed on the basis of facts, not on the basis of simply old ancient history or whatever. So I think that that is something that has been missing here, that there's no sincere positioning that we have seen so far from the Chinese side to take it forward on that. Of course, we work together with them in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS and RIC 3 formats, as well as in G20 and other international mechanisms. So bilaterally, this issue is very much there. And I think until and unless that is solved. Now you can imagine that these principles are very nice. For example, violation of your sovereignty and territorial integrity is the most fundamental principle. Now, if that is not respected, the agreements that you sign are not respected, then how can you say that my foreign policy is only based on these 5 principles? So that has been one of the basic things. So you say something else and you do something else, and that's how, unfortunately, the world is witnessing today. Now, and I have seen it various agreements I have gone through and various statements, and I found that between 1954 onwards, every time whenever we met or signed an agreement, these 5 principles were always done there. And you have also seen that again in the recent times, you have seen that we are just of the 70th anniversary, President Xi Jinping once again mentioned that this could be the basis of peaceful coexistence. No doubt about it. But then charity begins at home. So we should try to start it from where actually there is a problem. And so that is why this is very important that we need to continue to understand that. Now, in the process, what has India done? India essentially has been asking for 3 things, which has been raised again and again with our Chinese friends. And that is that there should be 3 M's. That is mutual respect, mutual interests, and the mutual trust. These are very important. So if you do not have mutual sensitivities, you don't have mutual interest, you don't have mutual respect, you can't have mutual trust. Now that is something, this is a fundamental principle which in a nutshell really encapsulates what these 5 principles essentially entail. The world can live in peace provided each country followed those. And that's what is the hope now. Another thing that India has said, now many of the experts have said that we must move beyond Panchsheel. That has been Mr. Ram Madhav, who is one of the leading experts who has written about it. The India-China should move beyond. But it's not a question of only India-China, it's a question the global community needs to understand the import of these principles. So whatever principles we agree upon, those principles must be respected in right intent and right earnest. That is very important. So how India looks at it today, while it is going through this policy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, dialogue, diplomacy, and the respect for UN Charter, those are very, very important. Because United Nations and the multilateralism and multipolarity is extremely important for the global goods. But what we are witnessing more and more is essentially the growth of, essentially what we are witnessing is the growth of hostility across countries, growth of unilateralism across major powers. They prefer only unilateral actions, whether it's the United States, whether it's Russia, or whether it's China. And that's what, unfortunately, happens to basic ingredient that we witness of these major powers. A formula India has extended, which is, we call it now as 5S. That is, this is so nowadays being referred to as the new Panchsheel principles, and which are like 5S approach. First S is Samman, respect. The second S is Samvad, that is dialogue. Third S is Sahyog, that is cooperation. 4S is Shanti, which is peace, and Samriddhi, that is prosperity. But in order to achieve that, you have to once again follow a certain other 5 principles, which Indian Prime Minister Modi nowadays talks about. And he said that for this, very important to have the right soch, thought should be correct. Your sampark, the connect should be maintained. That's very important, the contact. Then we need to cooperate, sahyog. And there should be a determination, sankalp, to succeed in this. And that's when your sapne or the dreams of a peaceful coexistence of the world can be fulfilled. So I think that this is something that India today is trying to follow, whether it is neighborhood first policy, whether it's Act East policy, whether it's G20 presidency, anywhere you see, that is how India is looking at these issues. But I'll be very happy now to take the question because you asked me to speak for 20 minutes, and I think 20 minutes are over. So we'll be very happy to answer any questions. I didn't want to read out many of the statements in which it's very clearly again and again mentioned. So we all know that most of you are researchers in this area. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, for very interesting and comprehensive remarks. We have received lots of questions. So without selecting, I'm picking them because we have received some on Twitter, some on WhatsApp, and some on other platforms. Let me pick the first question. It says that peaceful coexistence can ideally be the solution to all global problems. Then why, in your opinion, is that the world continues to be dominated by neo-realist principles?
Neo-revisionist?
Neo-realist.
Neo-realist. Well, that's what it is. There is a fight always has been between idealism or what we call as Ram Raj to get that, or on the other hand, what is really obtains. And what really obtains is that the powers continue to fight for greater influence. Each country serves its own national interest in the first place as a part of the foreign policy. And very often there are less accommodation available to another country, another person. That's why there is a conflict. So this is what you just simply look at in your family, you look at in your neighborhood, you look at nearby, and you will find that these basic fundamental principles of human behavior have also become equally ingrained in the international behavior. And this is something that, another thing what we are witnessing today is that the international liberal trading order that was established in the post-World War II scenario, unfortunately, is crumbling. And for their disruption, a lot of credit must go to the countries that founded them. They have failed to really continue to pursue that. And that's something I feel is the main reason that we are seeing this kind of thing.
So let me move to the next question. How do the principle of Panchsheel, particularly non-interference in internal affairs, align with modern international norms of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect R2P doctrine?
Well, as far as the responsibility to protect is concerned, this has been inserted in the United Nations Charter. But how it is to be used is something that is very important. You see, there are vulnerable communities, there are vulnerable people. And when we signed up for the United Nations, at that time, it was important that this was understood that when you are looking at a global governance or collective governance, at that time, you are ceding a certain part of your sovereignty to that country while you are agreeing to that UN Charter. And therefore, it is provided. But I have seen that how the R2P played. I was myself the ambassador in Libya, and how it was bombed the place under the garb of the R2P, while there was nothing. And if you were to fully see it, you will find that this was actually a pre-planned thing. The people were unhappy. They wanted change, but then you do not allow the change and you go on and start bombing the place like that under the garb of right to protect. So there are many things, as many of you who are studying international affairs know, that there's something called gray zone warfare. So you create that condition in such a way of the gray zone warfare that it looks to the world, or as you wish to project, that this is something that there is a genocide taking place, this is happening or that is happening. And then you invoke at the UN, and then you just go and start bombing them. Now, subsequently, everybody realized. You have seen what happened in Iraq. So today, there is a defiance of the international order. UN Security Council resolutions we are seeing now today, whether in the Russia-Ukraine war or in the Israel-Hamas war, that the states are not able to, and there is no enforcement. The bigger powers have set an example of unilateral interventions. So then they find some excuses and pretexts to go and intervene. But that is unfortunate reality. That's why you have to also look at it from both. Idealistic is something that we need to achieve, or at least try to achieve, and realist is what you have to contend on a daily basis.
So let me move to the next question. Like in today's fractured global order, characterized by rising nationalism and global geopolitical tension, how relevant are Panchsheel principle? And there is another, like what are the main challenges in implementing the Panchsheel principle in international relations since its inspection?
Well, as I mentioned, that in the United Nations Charter, it was accepted already in the United Nations General Assembly in 1957. They incorporated there in the UN. That means these are the principles which very much exist there. But then it is for the individual states to apply then in their international discourse with the other country. Now, how you can do it? I mean, it can only be done by dialogue and diplomacy. It cannot be done by pushing it down the throat of somebody. If you are going to enforce anything, then they will be thinking that this is, you are being hegemonistic. So it is very important that the big countries create an example of cohabitation and working together for the other countries who are not that advantaged to be able to follow those principles. Now, there are not only this, but you look at the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. In view of the wars, in view of the pandemic, all these, though nobody cares about the Sustainable Development Goals anymore. Look at the climate change, this is a very major crisis. Now, in that crisis, we are seeing that the advanced countries had agreed to provide $100 billion a year. Nothing. Absolutely nobody is, despite promises. You look at the terrorism dimension. Countries use it as an instrument of their state policy, but nobody is bothered about it. People are talking about my terrorist versus your terrorist, that kind of a syndrome. Now, in those kind of challenges and situations, it becomes increasingly difficult to see that the idealistic scenario can succeed or prevail.
Let me move to the next question. We have Numan, who is saying that we have witnessed for several years the relationship between India and China has been ups and downs. Are you also mentioning, as you also mentioned, India has always been ready for the Sahyog, for the Samriddhi and Santi, but China did not respond as per the expectations. So in such a situation, what do we think should be the realistic and practical approach of India to maintain Santi and Samriddhi in the region?
Well, India is continuing to talk to the Chinese. We have institutional mechanisms. At the moment, we don't have any high-level direct exchanges. There are meetings with the ministers at the sidelines. Even Prime Minister met in Johannesburg with the President Xi Jinping briefly on the sidelines, but there was no formal meeting as it is. So that particular, I would say, the situation has been very difficult in that sense, that because most of the days today, as you know, that diplomacy is really conducted at the highest level, and those contacts are missing today. But how can you go ahead when you have not one, but many instances like that? We have seen, number one, that you had the violation of the territories of India, 10,000 over square kilometers, they're sitting on it. You had incidents on Galwan. You do not have any settlement of the border issue that is going back to pre-Galwan. That is not happening. There's some, except in some sections. Then you have this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is going through Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which is India's territory, claimed territory. So obviously, in this kind of situation, there is a fundamental violation of your territorial integrity and sovereignty. That's one reason that India did not subscribe to the BRI. Now, in that kind of a situation, it is very difficult to think of any normalcy in a very short time. Nor India is also not going to give in at this stage. Although I must say that our economic ties and relations with them are very strong. We are still have $130 billion and $35 billion of trade, which is one of the highest this time. Then we also work with China on the international stage, whether it is for the pandemic, if it was for example, seeking waiver for other countries, global south, for the vaccines. So India worked together. So wherever global challenges of that nature are there, we are continuing to work with them. And of course, we have in the regional organizations also work together. But on the bilateral level, we have some major problems. And until and unless China becomes sensitive to India's concerns, it will be very difficult to have a normal business as usual.
We have another question that how can the principle of Panchsheel promote economic cooperation and development among nations, especially in the context of global economic disparities?
Well, global economic disparities and I would say the differential between various countries across the world, because every country is not gifted the same way. Some countries have natural resources, other countries have human resources, some have human resources and natural resources both. Some don't have any. I mean, they have very little populations, small countries. They are suffering. For example, countries like Maldives and others, due to the climate change, they are being affected, they're threatened. Their survival is threatened. So in this, that's the reason we have this World Trade Organization and other to some kind of a calibration in the international discourse. But at the same time, what can happen? Suppose you may not produce, but there are increased dependencies among countries, and that's why the trade takes place. There could be a trade deficit. Like India, for example, imports about 85% of its energy requirements, crude requirements from countries. So to have a trade balance in your favor is difficult. So therefore, you have to find certain countries that are exporting more than importing less. So I think that this is something that we will have to work together. There is a balance. It can also be changed because you can become a better service industry. So today, like for example, India's service exports are very high. And then you have to try to identify niche areas which can make you into Singapore, a small country, but it's very powerful because of its logistics, its technological advancement. So size of a country, or for that matter, the kind of opportunities it has. Then you have to find partners where your synergies exist. The countries which will be happy to trade with you, work with you, and that. So I think that those are some of the decisions that the governments of various countries do take. It requires a lot of labor in order to identify and discuss the kind of agreements that you want to do with certain countries. And I think this is something that we need to carry forward.
So we have received a very interesting question on cyberspace. There are two questions. One is, in the world where digital diplomacy is becoming increasingly important, how can the principles of Panchsheel be adopted to foster international cooperation in cyberspace? And another, can the Panchsheel principle designed during the specific historical context effectively adopt to address the complexities of contemporary international relations, such as cyber warfare and ideological clashes?
You know, with the growth of technology, these are challenges which the humanity will have to continue to face. And these cybersecurity and these challenges I do not put into the bilateral context, even though they operate in the bilateral context. But these are some things there we have to think in the global response. And the global response is that nowadays, for example, with the artificial intelligence, there are treaties being signed, they are being discussed, countries are having their own agreements, and then they are having agreements with some of the EU had recently done it. So you have to align with them. So what is the use, how the technology is to be used? That is very important. cyber attacks are becoming very, very frequent. So how to have your kind of firewalls is very important. Could we have some kind of a code of conduct? It's easy to say, easy to frame, difficult to implement, because these get combined into the way a foreign policy is being conducted. Today, unfortunately, non-state actors and terrorists use technology far more efficiently and effectively than the normal states do. They are always a step ahead and try to disrupt the order that you are in. So this is something for which there is a global collaboration is required, and there are increasing voices for having some kind of standards in this area.
So, given the rise of population and skepticism towards multilateralism in some parts of the world, how can Panchsheel principles offer a viable alternative or complement to traditional diplomatic approaches?
Well, I think the multipolarity or strategic autonomy, frankly, does not mean that you need to sacrifice these principles. These principles are common sense principles. You see, this is for behavioral pattern for the states. What is wrong with this saying that we must respect the territorial integrity? I mean, your nation states have come into being. There have been territorial issues, those should be resolved bilaterally, rather than we are no longer living in old princely states when a king is not happy and he goes and invades. Unfortunately, some of the superpowers have taken that way, and that way has disrupted the global order. So today we are actually either between the transitional world order or we are in a disorder, complete disorder. And therefore that's why I said in the beginning that the global governance is in tremendous crisis. We have the voice of Global South, which is ignored. And that's the reason India tried to take it up when its G20 presidency came in. First thing it did was to talk to countries from the Global South. 125 countries participated in that, to understand from them what are their needs, and then plug into this G20 format. And that's why these issues were basically raised and brought in. That's why the African Union was made into a permanent member, bringing interests of 55 African countries on board. So I think that this is how the gradually with the multipolarity is the way forward, but the unilateral approaches of the superpowers are going to be also confronted at the same time by the rest of the world.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to the next question. There is another interesting question that what role did Panchsheel play in the non-aligned movement, and how can this legacy be leveraged today?
Sorry, I could not understand. What is it?
What role did Panchsheel play in the non-aligned movement, NAM, and how can this legacy be leveraged today?
Well, non-alignment movement at that time, but today what we are looking at is more and more smaller minilaterals and plurilateral organizations are coming up. We have regional organizations like we have SAARC, we have BIMSTEC, we have BBIN, we also have IMAC, we have I2U2, and a umpteen number of organizations, Quad and others. Now they have limited objectives. So they are very much a part of it, the today's global discourse. And I think that is a part of the transition. Because if, in my view, we are going to see a polarization of the world with two groups, one led by China, the other led by the United States, then I think that countries, large number of countries which prefer that strategic autonomy is their preferred course of diplomatic discourse, they will try to be in one of these third grouping or pole, which would be called as, at that time it used to be called non-alignment, but today we call it as strategic autonomy or multi-alignments.
We have got two questions almost on similar lines. First is that in what ways might the Panchsheel principle of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence be applied to address current geopolitical tension, such as trade dispute or territorial conflict? And there's another interesting question that respect for territorial integrity and non-aggression are two principles of Panchsheel. India and China follow the same foreign policy of Panchsheel. Do you think they follow the principle of, they really implement what they advocate?
Well, I think that this is what I've been talking for quite some time on these issues. What I try to say is that these policies are fundamental principles for coexistence, as we say. We have to live means there should be mutual respect, that there should be that you respect the red lines of other country. Who's your friend? Now, whether it is on the borders or whether it is in terms of promoting extremism and terrorism in another country. So today, what people are doing is they are taking very non-traditional security threats have come in between the two countries. And that's what I mentioned, the gray zone warfare also in that sense. Without directly fighting one another, you may try to undermine the credibility of the country's government and interfere in them. So these are the things that are real, but they can only come when we understand that each one has its own view and we must respect those views. We must respect that country and its national aspirations. If you want to help somebody, the request for help should also come from that country where we are going to help. We should not try to tell them that, yes, we know everything and we will be able to do everything. So this is something, I feel that we need to be sensitive to the other country, whether it's our neighbor or countries anywhere in the world. So until and unless we respect their sovereignty, territorial integrity, that is the fundamental principle. If that is not carried on, then you can't carry on anything else.
Thank you, sir. We are running out of time, so we'll take maybe 2 to 3 questions maximum. One is that how do you view the principle of Panchsheel in the context of the current geopolitical tension, particularly between major powers like US, China, and Russia? Do you think that they respect such principle, though they are signatory to UN Charter, and that is based on Panchsheel?
I think that the biggest problem with the multilateral organizations is that they are not able to reform themselves. They are still suffering from this mentality of or mindset of victor and vanquished of the 1945. And so in the 21st century, they have to realize that there are other countries which have become bigger powers, have bigger contributions to make, and the reforms are absolutely essential in those. But then coming to this, the organizations cannot reform themselves. Organizations are made by the constituent countries. In my view, the biggest stumbling block for the reforms of these organizations, whether it is Bretton Woods institutions like IMF or World Bank or World Trade Organization or the United Nations, these are in the United Nations, essentially, these are P5 countries. They say on your face, yes, we want reforms, but they play upon the internal problems between the countries who are aspirants to become part of that. So they divide and rule policy very well continues in that. And that's why they no reform. So relevance of the United Nations will go down further. And then I'm all for, India is all for supporting the multilateral institutions, a multipolar world. But we have to see that this works. And for this, every country must have a reasonable approach to these issues. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. And I think that their Panchsheel principles, which have been adopted by the UN, should provide, I think, a way forward in that.
We have received lots of questions in this regard, like in an era of all non-alignment or multipolarism, how do the principle of Panchsheel fit in to convince the Western world that function in its own rule? And then also, like, how do we see the role of international organizations like UN in supporting, promoting Panchsheel? Let me put the last question for today. Panchsheel emphasizes peaceful coexistence between states. How can these principles be applied to address issues like proxy war and state-sponsored terrorism, where conflicts play out indirectly between the nations?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned about these non-traditional threats. And the countries are using these as tools. There are certain toolkits many countries adopt. They are clandestine in nature, which means clearly that when you are beginning from that premise of hurting the sensitive interests of another country or impinging on its territorial integrity or its sovereignty, whether real or even in terms of in practice. Now, that means you have already abdicated those principles which have been provided in the Panchsheel. They are the guiding principles. There is no enforcement. The enforcement mechanism is in the multilateral organizations. and multilateral organizations like the United Nations and others, if are not functional enough, you will see when it is some countries, the small countries, they will come with the might of the UN Security Council resolutions onto them, and even impose those sometimes. We have seen it in many countries. But when a question of their own interest is concerned, or their own critical ally is involved in that, then they will veto that particular thing, howsoever sensitive it is. I'm sorry to say about even China is fighting against terrorism. It has a problem it faces in its own backyard, but then it puts technical hold in the UN Security Council committees on Pakistani terrorists. Now, what are you doing in that? You are promoting terrorism indirectly. So those are the things the countries have to decide. Are they giving them something in return? Or it is good for them? No principle can be fully applied. You know that UN Charter very clearly provides for it, but who is going to enforce that? The UN Security Council. Because UNGA resolution, which has all 193 odd countries saying something, nobody bothers about it. They just forget about it completely. I think that this is a situation that we need to address.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, thank you so much for your interesting discussion. We really enjoyed and learned a lot. We still have questions, but maybe we should have another session in future. I, on behalf of NIICE and our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We'd also like to thank all our audience who are watching us from Zoom and Facebook Live for their wonderful question. Thank you so much and have a nice day. Thank you, sir.